Where does the Black experience in Minnesota begin?
And then that's when we found the houses.
Tribal historian Jim Jones has found clues on the shores of Leech Lake. This may have been the site of a trading post of the famous Black fur trader named George Bonga. In a village near the confluence of Lake Superior and the St. Louis River, an Ojibwe woman married Pierre Bonga, a Black fur trader. Their children, including son George Bonga, born around 1802, would be the first known people of African ancestry born in Minnesota. In the early 1800s, the fur trade was the heartbeat of the heartland. Along with the fur-trapping Native Americans and the fur companies, there were the legendary voyageurs.
Engagés, voyageurs, were basically the truck drivers of the fur trade. They paddled the canoes, they hauled the goods, they built the posts, they did the hunting, they did all the labor.
Known for songs as colorful as their dress, the voyageurs drove the area's culture and commerce. After attending school in Montreal, George Bonga began work in the fur trade like his father, Pierre Bonga, and his grandfather, Jean Bonga, before him.
He knew how to get around in the country, where the best routes were, where you could portage from one place to another, where a good place for a post would be.
He was a huge man. I mean, big by even contemporary standards, and a powerful man.
There's one account that he portaged 700 pounds. They were human machines, and men who were strong, who put up with hardships day in and day out, were valued. And most of them wore out pretty fast. It was a lifestyle that used people up.
But not Bonga, although his longevity in the business was due to more than just brute strength.
He had to be somewhat of an intellect. One, he was very skilled in languages. He was educated in Montreal. So he did not come to the frontier without skills, without intellectual attributes. He was an entrepreneur as well.
In 1838, George Bonga received his license to trade. As a trader clerk for the American Fur Company, Bonga eventually ran a post on Leech Lake, where he would have a home for the rest of his life. The experience of the French Indian Métis and the few early black settlers suggests that, in these early days of Minnesota, race was often irrelevant.
This was the frontier, which meant the survival was key. And in a frontier, you don't have the luxury to discriminate. And so it was possible to find all kinds of roles that Black people could fill and all kinds of identities that they could acquire for themselves.
Native people identified anybody who didn't live in their way, whether they're Dakota or Ojibwa people, as white people. Bonga's part of that in his work as a trader. He and another man claimed to have been the first two white men in the country in the area they were trading with the Ojibwa, but not as a white man racially, but as a participant in European culture.
So the notion of color and race is fluid.
George Bonga knew Ojibwa. His mother was Ojibwa. He had an Ojibwa wife.
George, like his brother Stephen, used this multicultural background to work as a diplomat translator. Both the Bonga brothers' signatures can be found on major treaties between the United States and sovereign tribes.
And that's no easy place to be because you had to be trusted by both sides.
Bonga's Cultural Balancing Act did strain his relations with his mother's people. In 1837, the trading post of William Atkins was robbed. Atkins' son was killed in the raid. A member of the pillager Ojibwe was the prime suspect. George Bonga tracked the accused killer through the Minnesota winter for days. He finally captured the suspect and brought him to the authorities at Fort Snelling. After his return to his trading post on Leech Lake, Bonga mentioned the tension he encountered.
The Indians say, if Chigawaskung is missing, they will set fire to my store and break my canoes for my part. I don't think they are really in earnest in these words.
Despite this, Bonga's standing with the Ojibwe remained good. He eventually started a family at Leech Lake.
George married into the Leech Lake band. He took a wife from the Anigam community here. He accepted them. They accepted him.
We find in history there was a certain element of trust that seemed to exist between Native peoples and people of African descent.
The Black pioneer gained the respect of many of Minnesota's white founding fathers, and Elder Bonga used his legendary status to advocate for Native Americans who were being pushed further into the realm of the reservation. In the late 1860s, letters he wrote to government officials reveal his contempt for corrupt government Indian agents.
Respected sir, I am really sorry to have to say that I have lost all hopes in Major Clark. It is a disgrace to the government to have such an agent. I have not hesitated to make known to you my opinion in the matter of great importance to the Indians and the people of the frontier. Hoping that the Great Spirit will so guide our ways that we may meet again and have another good campfire talk, I remain yours, George Bonga.
I mean, he was a man of substance.
He was one of the forefathers of the state, one of the pioneers.
Bonga died at Leech Lake in 1874. He and his siblings had several children who continued to have experiences that spoke to their unique heritage. George's daughter, Susie Bonga, had been a rising leader among the Ojibwe women of Leech Lake. But white racism towards Blacks began to influence some Native Americans, which presented obstacles for Susie Bonga. Photos of son William Bonga, one as deputy, the other as tribal delegate to Washington, seem to capture the Bonga's cultural crossroads. 200 years after the birth of George Bonga, conversations on a genealogy website showed the descendants of this pioneer family are still pondering their unique background. Along with their living legacy, namesake landmarks with variations on the spelling of the family name dot the land and county.
To me, this is his place.
Jim Jones and others continue to make discoveries that help unravel the story of the Bongas and Minnesota's pre-territorial history.
Have something like that come over.
But on this day, the Pillager band member made another discovery, a brilliant rainbow that appeared over the rough waters of Leech Lake. A colorful connection between two far-off points, just like George Bonga.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our episode 2 of our educational series by ROTI, Reflections of Turtle Island. And we have our elder Ron Williams speak to our audience regarding this month's episode.
Well, welcome, and I'm excited to begin this second of the series of our monthly educational series by inviting you to join in, relax, join in the discussion if you must. We have a chat line, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, we do.
And I'm Ron Williams. I'm the co-founder and president of the Reflections of Turtle Island. This is my wife, Mary.
Hello.
And enjoy.
My name is Les Fry, and I'm with Native Brown Media and Clip Dive Productions. I'm also a board member, and we have also with us one of our other board members, Mr. Barry Lee. And tonight we are very excited to have our special guest talking about the past, present, and future of Black Indians. We have Jay Winter Nightwolf with us, and shortly, Mr. Darwin Strong, who is the descendant of George Bonga, the video that we just saw a few minutes ago. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring in Mr. Nightwolf, and hopefully then Mr. Strong will join us afterwards. Hello, Jay. How are you?
How are you?
How are you? Thank you. Good to see you too. I'm very excited to talk about this specifically because this is something that you and I talk at, when I first met Jay, I actually had a conversation with him regarding this when I was working at AT&T. And we brought a lot of attention to a little known history that's somewhat of a hidden history between Black and Indigenous people and the intersection of the two people. So Jay, since Darwin is not here, can you just kind of give us just a little bit of history on George Bonga? And then when he does come in, we'll kind of go on a little bit further about George Bonga.
George Bonga, Darwin Strong's great-great-grandfather, was a miraculous man. He was a huge man. He was an educated man. His mom and dad sent him to Canada to get his education. He was an African, and if it wasn't for George Bonga and his efforts, Minnesota would have never gotten into the fur trade. And when they got into the fur trade through George Bonga, that was a very big opportunity for Minnesota to become one of the leading states in the fur trade business. A lot of money was made there.
Definitely. And one of the things that I think was very important that people understand is that he did not identify as Black or African American, which is typically what most people would identify him as, but he was both African and Ojibwe. He was both Black and Indigenous. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, it's very interesting because he does not fit phenotypically the appearance of someone who is of mixed heritage.
True, very true. But his mind and his skills, he was a diplomat.
Definitely. He was a diplomat. And that's the thing, that he walked between two worlds. He literally walked between two worlds. He was the connector between the Europeans, because he was educated in Montreal, and the Ojibwe people. And he basically set up alliances between the two so that there would not be so much strife between the two people in this new land that they were now living in. So he's definitely a historic figure. I highly recommend that we find out a little bit more about him, but we have to move on since Darwin isn't here. And let's talk a little bit about the intersection of Black and Indigenous people and how long that intersection has been going on. Jake, could you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yes. over 50,000 years ago, the first Black people to come here were the people, the Phoenicians. And as back then, the white man would make you think that they were white merchants. They were not. They were Black ocean-going sea merchants from Phoenicia. And they came here to the eastern part of the United States. And some of the tribes, like the people up in the Northeast, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, they got involved in international trading with the Phoenicians because they traveled on their large boats with them. And there was no strife or, there was nothing crazy about that. So the first Black people that came here were the Phoenicians.
So I did a little history right here, and it said this was 2,000 years before Columbus supposedly discovered America, that the Phoenicians found this part of North America, as we know as Turtle Island, founded by accident because they were seafaring people. They came to the south coast of Turtle Island, and because they were maritime people, they followed the stars here. And you said something that was very important. There was no strife. There was no warring. It was more of a trade, an exchange between two cultures going back and forth, a giving of cultural items, food, things like that. That's literally what this relationship was so many years ago. And it's important that I said this because I want everybody to understand that those who came here prior to Columbus, the majority of the time, there was not about conquering land. It was an exchange between two people, two cultures.
They had heard stories for years out of Europe about people being on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And they came here out of curiosity because they wanted to see who these people were. And when they got here, they were very surprised that these were kind, loving, and friendly people. This whole thing about race, that's a social construct. That didn't come from, as we know, white people, Black people, anybody else. It's all about economics, and that's where the division came in between all of us.
Mm. And yes, race is definitely a new construct. It was something that did not exist prior to. And let's talk about the Vikings. The Vikings came here also about in the 10th century, which was 1,000 years ago, who also came here. And from what I understand, they came to Newfoundland. There's evidence of intermarriage between the Vikings and indigenous people. And that recently they found bones of a Native American woman in, I think it was Norway. Something like that.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. I've brought some books here, so we can definitely share some of that information with our audience afterwards and post some things that you can listen to or read regarding that. Now let's talk about this. This is very interesting because this is recent. The found evidence of the Chinese also actually visiting America. We have Zhang He, who was a seafaring man who came right before Columbus, and he had the globe of the world before Magellan did. So there's evidence of the Chinese actually intermingling and meeting with indigenous people. They recently found a stone that had what they thought were hieroglyphics on it, but they actually believed that it was ancient Chinese writing.
Yes. He came here 71 years before Columbus. My good friend, who is in spirit world now, Dr. Jack D. Forbes, who was an Indian from Virginia, and at the time that he lived, he became the go-to person about Native Americans. He actually founded the first Native American university in California, University of Davis, Southern California of Davis. And a lot of our great Native people actually went there and graduated from there, like Dennis Banks. And our history is so deep and intertwined that I think humanity, or the human family, need to stop making all these excuses about being related to each other. This Admiral Zhang he was a Muslim Chinese. And this man was so smart, And there's a lot of stuff that, like the Irish, when Dr. Jack Forbes was invited to speak because he taught at the University of Southern Cal Davis, but he also was a professor at Oxford University. So he went to Ireland, Galway, and when he was teaching there, some of the professors there and archaeologists were saying, we've got some things that we don't know where they came from. So can you please come and identify them? Well, he went there and he looked at the artifacts. He says, these are from the North American Indian people. So they have records of us traveling into Europe and setting up all kinds of relationships and friendships and businesses. So this whole thing about racism, I wish they would just put that in a bag and dump it in the ocean somewhere.
Well, let's talk about that. We're going to get to that, but we're primarily here to talk about the intersection between Black and Indigenous people. Let's talk about this. This is very significant. Mansa Musa coming here, the Mali Empire coming here. Can you kind of just give us a little brief history on that?
I think I would prefer either my friend Barry Lee or my new friend. Yeah, I would like for them to comment on that.
Let me give you a little bit of a background just in case, so you all can have some context here. So the Mali Empire actually came to what is now South America around 1311 AD, and which was 181 years before Columbus. Mansa Musa had a net worth of over $400 billion. He was the wealthiest kingdom in Africa. And they, contrary to what is popular belief, this was a seafaring nation of people that actually constructed boats and traveled along the Bering Strait and along the coast to different nations, carrying with them items from their kingdom, gold spears and such, sweet potatoes, things like that, the yam. So they came to the southern coast of America, and it was once again a cultural exchange of gifts, of items, and also intermarriage. Some of the sailors did not go back to Mali Empire. They actually stayed in South America and intermarried with the indigenous of South America. So Barry or Ron, please comment on that if you like.
Well, I'll go first. And admittedly, I know very, very little about this. And so I really can't comment too much. But it's always been that old. Oh, you take a look at Africa and see how it kind of fits right into South America, and how everything it just looks like a sun and ocean came between them. But I don't think it wasn't there at the time. I don't know, but I know very little. I heard something about like the Mali, but Empire, but I know very, very little about it. I have to apologize.
Well, that's why we're here, to educate ourselves and actually educate our audience members on this history. Ron, would you like to comment, or Mary?
Well, on the same note, I'm somewhat unaware or unfamiliar with the trade relationship. We do know that, and I think evidence continues to be presented that Christopher Columbus was not a person who discovered anything. He accidentally, got lost and landed somewhere. But what we do know is that the indigenous communities on this continent and the South American continent were traders. They shared their goods, and they were constantly looking for new markets and open to new markets. What we find from the south going north, we realize that the Asian influence has been a constant. The trade routes that were established thousands of years ago and continued right up to the European invasion or incursion existed, and there was merchandise that a European couldn't explain why they existed. But this is fascinating, and I'm appreciating what I'm seeing right now. What I'm hearing.
Leslie, can I get in here for a second? I have my good friend Rick Tatum, who's visiting us today, along with his wife, and he would like to make some comments about, what happened back then too. So let me introduce you to Rick Tatum. Rick, this is my television producer and good friend, Leslie Fry. So let me put him on.
Rick, the board of ROTI.
Mm-hmm.
Good evening.
Good evening, Rick.
Hey, Rick.
You brought up an interesting point about the West African kingdom.
Can you move his camera just a little? Rick, can you move in just a little bit? Go ahead. Thank you.
There were several kingdoms in West Africa that were aligned, and they did travel the world. They traveled the Mediterranean, they traveled to Northern Europe, and they traveled to the east coast of North and South America. So yeah, it's documented, and again, it's a part of history that needs to be explored more.
Definitely.
And be contextualized into what happened in the New World, because it just wasn't a circumstance of the Western European, coming to, the New World and finding societies that they tried to subjugate. So you can find added as you move forward through this discourse that you're going through. So it may be important to keep that point in mind as well.
Thank you. All right, so let's just go talk about it. When the Europeans did come here, they found 600 tribal nations, over 60 million people were here that were established way before that. And it's important that we're discussing this in particular because we were talking about phenotype. I want people to understand that this group of people that you see in this board right here are people that are in this particular show this evening on our educational series. You understand that we are all different variants of color. And that is similar to what we were back then. We were people of different colors. So it's important that I'm talking about this specifically about phenotype because this is going to come into play during the transatlantic slave trade, which we're going to get to, as well as how we were misidentified. So I just want people to know that this is the representation of what they saw when they came here. These were Fox Indians from Wisconsin, and understand the color of these individuals that were here.
Yeah, they were part of the Sac and Fox Nation.
Exactly. So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead briefly because we do still have some content to go through. We have a few more minutes, so I just want to get through. We have a lot to get through.
I think some of the numbers were wrong, and it's not your fault. When they came here to what is known as the United States of America, there were over 1,200 nations, established nations. And in the first, I'd say, 100 years of coming here, they killed over 100 million Native American people. This is all fact and documented. And the treaties that they made with our nations were not designed to bring peace, but to steal land. And we need to just be a little more focused on what happened then. How do you kill 100 million people inside of the first 100 years? How do you do that and not feel any guilt about it?
What's interesting too is the idea of possession. We as Indigenous people never possessed the land, but possession was a European ideology. And so coming in and possessing this land, taking over this land was one of the reasons why they annihilated the people that were here. And there's many reasons why. We could get into that. We could have a whole nother show about why we were annihilated. You know, I have my own personal beliefs about that as well. But since we do have to go into a little bit more context about the intersection of Black and Indigenous people, that's definitely another show that we can have, and we can have you come back and talk about that.
Sure.
So we were talking about primarily about race being a social construct and something that is kind of new. So I've actually found some newspaper clippings of people who came here before the transatlantic slave trade that were sold into indenturitude. So you notice at the top one, if you can look at it, and let me see if I can bring this up a little bit. It says that a Negro was supposed to be sold into indenturitude. And then if you notice underneath that, healthy German. If you see that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then below that were other people who were Europeans that came here that had trades, specific trades that they did. Blacksmiths, tool makers, bricklayers, and such. These were European people who sold themselves into indenturitude along with Black people who came here from Africa and Canada, that came and then sold themselves into indenturitude. So essentially, these two groups of people were actually intermingling with one another. There was no color there. So if you look before the mid 1600s, it was a combination of indentured servants and European descent and African descent. So it was an intermingling of these people. Servitude was not hereditary. You basically did a manuship for maybe 7 years, and then you bought out of your manuship and you started your own business or something. So there was like a possibility of freedom over that. And Africans, Europeans that came here, all of them were part of a socio-economic class. So money, have and have nots, was what defined Americans back in that time. But then when the transatlantic slave trade came about, this is when color became an issue. And it even started becoming more of an issue after that. Slaves could not own land. They didn't have rights. They never were freed. And so people were being put into, I would say, more of a caste system in America during this time.
True.
So two of the people that we were talking about, we have George Bonga and someone who is very familiar to our American history, Crispus Attucks. And when I was going to school, I was told that Crispus Attucks was the first Black man to die for America.
No.
But and the truth here is that he was of indigenous heritage. He was Black and indigenous. African American, as they say, and indigenous. So his father was a Black man of mixed heritage, and his mother was, I believe, I'm sorry, I can't really see this.
Wampanoag.
She was either Wampanoag or she was Natick. She was Natick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
New England Indians. Yeah.
Exactly. New England Indians.
Massachusetts Indians. Yeah.
So this is the first representation, George Bonga, Crispus Attucks, of those of us who were of this mixed heritage. And if you look at this picture today, someone of, because race is a new construct, you would identify these people as African American or Black, but these people are dual heritage or mixed heritage.
Yes, yes, yes.
So let's talk briefly about the Black Seminole Slave Rebellion and go into a little bit of context about that and the union between the Cimarron slaves, the Maroon slaves, and what we now know as the Seminole Nation in Florida. Jay, can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the Seminole Nation in Florida. When Thomas Jefferson, or was it Jefferson? Or Andrew Jackson decided to go into what they call Florida to free the people that had fled there. They were Black people that had escaped slavery because they knew they had a haven to run to, and that was with the Seminole Indians. So when they got down there, the U.S. cavalry that went in became gator bait, and that's what they used them for. And the Seminole Nation is the only nation that has never been defeated, according to U.S. history. Never been defeated.
So the rebellion between, so it was a combination of the Seminole and the Cimarrons, basically, slaves who had escaped down to Florida. When the U.S. Army was going down there, and the people that were trying to populate Florida at the time went down there. They basically, the natives knew how to navigate the land in Florida. And so you're saying when you say gator bait, they put them in certain pitfalls in order for them to die or fail. And it's interesting that you say this because there were about 5 or 6 slave rebellions during this time, but this Black Seminole Rebellion lasted from 1816 to 1858.
Yes, yes.
And from what I understand, the U.S. Army lost like billions of dollars in this war against the Seminoles, in addition to over 6,000 people, and that doesn't include those people that went down there that were civilians, died during this skirmish between the Seminoles and the U.S. Army.
Yes, they were actually lost on what to do. And they couldn't survive it. You know, I mean, if you go to Florida now, down in Seminole country, you'll find that still at least 50% of the land is swampland. And there are alligators everywhere. So Andrew Jackson made a big mistake. He was so arrogant and defiant. And he told the U.S. government, well, I'm going down there anyway. But it was a combination of the English, the Spanish, and those people that they call Latinos, which is no such thing. There's no such thing as a Latino. Latin was the language that the Roman Catholic Church used to do their misleading people. If you are from either what we know as North or South America, any of that, you are indigenous to this land. And if you go into South America, you'll find that they have chiefs and tribes just like we had since time immemorial. I have a lot of friends that happen to be labeled as Latinos, which I don't respect that terminology. And there's a lot to be had about this whole situation.
Now, it's funny that you're saying that because we have Ron here who is a Mexican heritage, and you told me something one time. You said there's no such thing as a Mexican, only indigenous people who speak Spanish.
That's right. That's right.
Because Mexican is the name given by Europeans, but if you do a census take of, there are more indigenous people in Mexico than all over the world, because the people there were indigenous.
Yes.
So it's very interesting. So let's talk about Juan Caballo, or John Horse, who was the leader of the Seminole Nation revolt against the U.S. Now, he is of Black and Native heritage. A lot of people don't know about him. He's a very interesting figure. He actually fled to Mexico City after this rebellion because they threatened his family. So they actually had to cede some of the land, unfortunately. But he was a very educated man, once again, a man who walked between both worlds. He spoke both English and he spoke both his native language. And he was, he spoke also French. He was a really interesting man. But a lot of people don't know about this man. And he fled down to Mexico, which incidentally, too, Mexico had a policy where they did not believe in slavery. So there were a lot of slaves that ran to Mexico. If you do a DNA test of the majority of the Mexicans in the country today, you will find that a large amount of them have African heritage as well as indigenous heritage.
Yes, they do. The language of the Latin is the language of the conquerors. Because when they came here, the Spanish conquered everything. Juan Pardo and those guys, they came here and they conquered everything south of Tejas. The French and the English and other people came from Europe, and they conquered, or they said they conquered, what is now known as North America. Mm-hmm. So if you really get into the deep history of it, and I wish we had more time, but There's a lot to this discussion that we need to continue to get into on a deeper level.
So and this is true, we might have to have a part 2 of this, but I kind of wanted to show a US census of how people of mixed heritage were misidentified, in particular people of Black and Indigenous heritage. So I don't know if you can actually see this, but if you're looking at, let's see, the orange segment right there that says white, and it says free or non-free white, and then you notice that it just continues to say white. Then if you look, I believe it is at, below that might be purple, it says Indian. Are you all able to see this?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So may have to add this to post for everyone. But if you notice where it says black, it says black, colored, black, mulatto, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon. Okay, so let me explain this real quickly, what this means. So people at that time, most people identify as mulatto as people who have a white parent and a Black parent. But in actuality, mulatto was the name given to most people that were of mixed heritage, that they could not identify what their heritage was. So if you notice, when it comes to Black people here in the United States, they went through a number of name changing until they became Negro and then African American. So what it did is it eliminated anybody of mixed heritage, and you were identified by phenotype by the US Census and the census takers when they came by, which basically dissolved all of your Native heritage and your European heritage if you had that. So it's very important that you see this, because a lot of Black people here in the United States that are of African American heritage are actually of Indigenous heritage or mixed race heritage, but have been forced to classify as Black.
Well, you know, if you want to know where it all started, Walter Flecker started that in Virginia when he became the director of the Census Bureau. If you were born a Native American, he would not allow that to be on your birth certificate. You either had to be white or colored, not Black, white or colored. But I have something to interject on what we were talking about, the Latinos and the Mexican people. So where the hell did Geronimo come from? And what about Chief Victorio?
Well, quite honestly, before those borders were established, they all came from the same place.
Exactly. As there were no borders. Borders were put in place to control the flow of people and economics. No other reason. None.
Oh, wow. Do you all have any comments? I'd love to hear from Barry and Ron just a little bit before we move on. A little bit more about this.
This is just a fascinating discussion. I agree. I think we really need to open it up a little bit wider. If we had the time to do it, I'm sure there are subject matters that we all could contribute our own experiences or knowledge with. We just don't have the time.
Yeah. So let me go ahead.
I really wonder, as I'm looking at the census, and I'm curious if I see a chart. I would love to see a chart like that, say for England.
It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It may exist as far as the people that have migrated there, but the majority of that, would be white English. But it doesn't.
I'd be curious about whether they have a breakdown such as this in there, because when it comes to race, for lack of a better term, you could pretty much tell how a nation works just by seeing their popular culture. And I have, since with the wonderful thing of Fire Stick and everything else, I'm able to get TV shows and watch TV shows, even from back in the 80s and 90s, from France, England, and other countries. And in their casting and their storylines, they don't care.
Yeah.
It's only in the U.S. that it seems to be a concern, which I find really fascinating. That's why I'd love to see if they even have that ethnic breakdown in their consensus, or in law keeping. They go just as far as male, female. That's about as far as it goes.
Yeah, it's we're. I think it's because we're such a young nation that
could be.
If you think about how we were established and who we were established by, these were penal colonies. So you have to think about the mentality of the people that came here that were outlaws in a sense.
Yeah.
The way that they thought. They were not as civilized as they would like to say that they were. They were not. You know, now let's not take away from the fact that it was the Europeans that started all of this, but at some point, you know, they gave up the ghost on it, and now it's something that we perpetuated.
So we know that the Spanish definitely as they entered the what they called the New World, they brought along with them a caste system.
Mm-hmm.
And if you I look into the various countries in South America, Central and South America, that caste system still exists. But that method of identifying the indigenous purity to the white purity, I think it had some influence on where we in this nation went in creating those identifications. I mean, caste systems existed then and now throughout the world.
Oh, I
and they are shared.
It seems like they were more concerned with economic caste.
Well, it was economics, because then the race tied into economics. Mm-hmm. Who could own property, who could not own property. That's basically what happened. So it's all been about, and it's interesting because you think that it is about race, but at the end of it all, the underlying component here is that it's about money and property. Yep. It's always been.
I would agree.
And who they could get to do the work free.
Yes, yes. Well, Tracy said the doctrine of discovery empowered Europeans to feel justified in colonizing genocide, and this is quite true. Exactly. Because they had to justify what they were doing. It was horrific.
Yeah.
They had to.
And we will have a discussion on the doctrine of discovery in one of our upcoming series.
Yes, we will, and we can get a little bit more in depth about that. Mm-hmm. So let me move on very quickly. We have about 10 minutes. So I want to talk specifically about the 5 civilized tribes, and these were the Cherokee, Choctaw, the Muskogee Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. Now, these are people who were in what I call the southern states of the United States, and these are groups of natives or tribes that had basically acclimated to European ways, even to the full extent of having slaves. Now, it was not as horrific as we would know slavery is today. It was more of indenturitude, where they had slaves that lived with them for about 7 years, and then they were allowed to marry into the tribes and into the community. They were inducted into the community. And it's very important that we talk specifically about them, because there are issues today underlying the mixed race people from these communities. So let's go on a little bit further.
I have one comment to make about that.
Yes.
Out of 1,200 nations that were already here before the European invaders came here, it's only 5 nations that are civilized. Come on.
So these, understand that the name was given civilized because they had adapted to European culture. Understand that was not the name we gave ourselves. No. That was the name that the Europeans gave them, because they adopted Christianity. They adopted Southern ways. And I want also to comment on the fact that the reason why these tribes adopted that is because the Southern nations were being pressed upon by Europeans. And in order for them to keep their land, they went ahead and they just agreed to whatever was going on around there so that they could keep their land. You know, I don't want anybody to think that they were turncoat or anything, but this is the only way. These tribes also had a small group of a tribe in comparison to other tribes. They were very small, especially the Choctaw Nation, who actually joined the Southern, joined the rebel army. I'm sorry, with the South, during the Civil War because their numbers were so low. And that came back to haunt them later once they were pushed into Oklahoma. So let's go on a little bit. So like I said, they actually had slaves. And when they were pushed to Oklahoma by Andrew Jackson, here again, we're going to come back to Andrew Jackson again because he just never got over the fact that he lost the war.
Mhm.
He was in charge of seeding all of these natives, pushing them out of their homelands and moving them into Oklahoma. So this is why we know the majority of what are now the 5 civilized tribes are now living in Oklahoma, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek nations. And they took along with them their slaves. In fact, their slaves were people that helped them survive on this path because these slaves knew how to forage for particular food and stuff like that. We lost so many of our people on this trek in the middle of the winter. 5,000 miles on foot they went to Oklahoma. And when they got there, understand that if you are the traditional steward of a particular type of land, you're familiar with that particular land. They were unfamiliar with this land. The land was rocky, it was hard. It didn't produce any food or anything like that. It did produce, however, oil. So,
And freezing temperatures.
yes, freezing temperatures.
These people came from warm states. They didn't know what it was like to try to survive in walking in many feet of snow. They didn't have what it took to survive.
We lost so many people.
And that fool Andrew Jackson knew it.
Yeah, he thought it was definitely a genocide walk. But what has happened now is because racism has now infiltrated these communities. When land was ceded and now oil was found on this land, there were people that were trying to get on what we call the Dawes Roll Commission. And the Dawes Roll, let me tell you, this was a commission that was set up by white European people to identify if you were Indian enough to have land in Oklahoma. They were the ones to determine if you were Indian enough. My great-great-grandfather was affected by this. Even though he was indigenous, he was not given land because I think personally, after reading the Dawes Roll, he was married to a Black woman and they weren't going to have it. But there were people that actually, it was so nefarious, this white board deciding if you were indigenous enough. There were people that were actually paying their way to get onto this Dawes Roll in order to have land in Oklahoma. And now, with more and more people being on that land being a wealth of oil, the indigenous population is now determining who is therefore Indian enough, they themselves are Indian enough to have this land. So they're kicking out people that they call the freemen people. And these are people who are the indigenous descendants of the slaves that they had, telling them that they're not Indian. And so this has caused a huge point of contention within the community, because racism somehow infiltrated our nations when there was never a question of color. It was always about who you belong to, what nation you belong to. It was never about color. However, the Cherokee Nation eliminated these bylaws recently, and now you could just determine by your heritage if you are Cherokee enough to join, but they are the only tribe that has done that.
You know, when when Smith was the so-called chief of the Cherokee Nation, I guess about 7-8 years ago, I went up against him because I had Dr. Jack D. Ford, Tex Hall, the chief of the 3 affiliated tribes, and a bunch of other people on a radio broadcast. And their question to him was, Tex asked him, he said, well, how do you get rid of your people? He said, well, they're freedmen's. And I had the president of the Freedmen's Association on that show too. And one of the things that Jack Forbes said to him was, what was his Smith? His name was Smith. He said, Chief Smith, If you shake your family tree, you're going to be surprised at who jumps out. And he was trying to eliminate all of the freedmen, Indians that had black blood, before there was the Trail of Tears, when there was just the Cherokee Nation on the East Coast. Those people had intermarried in the tribe for hundreds of years. So how do you go and try to purify this? You know, it's the same thing that Adolf Hitler tried to do, the Aryan nation. Just think about it. This is all by habit of what they've done over these years.
So we definitely want to talk about that, because there's more to that story that we want to talk about. And I have to bring you back and talk about that particular story. But you told me one time that Chief Billy Tyak said something to you about who is Native American. And so I found something that said that Native Americans are the people who contain blood of the one or more than 500 distinguished tribes that still endure and exist as sovereign and unsovereign states within the United States today.
Yeah.
These are the descendants of those who were pre-Columbian indigenous people of North America. So that basically says that if you contain that blood, you still contain the memory, the hopes, the desires of the indigenous people that were there. It's just up to you to decide if that is something that you're going to pursue. And I want to personally say something here. One of the reasons why this is so very important to me is, once again, I'm going to go back to my grandfather being trying to be on the Dawes Roll. I am of Choctaw heritage, but he was denied that because he wasn't Choctaw enough to someone else's standards. It didn't say that he was not indigenous. It just said no, that he was not going to be able to claim land. But here's the thing: if I don't claim that side of my heritage, then I am completely breaking off a whole part of my identity that lives here. That means I will forget my grandmother. I have to forget my grandfather, his mother. The nation, the world is telling me I must forget them. And it is a type of genocide to say that I have to walk on and be something else instead of claiming who I really am. We have about 1 minute before our 8 o'clock mark. Can we go ahead? Elder Nightwolf, do you have something real quick to say?
When I had Chief Billy Tyak on my show, he was the chief of the Piscataway Indian Nation of Maryland. And I asked him, I said, Uncle Billy, who is an Indian? And his definition was, an Indian is one who carries the sacred ancient blood of the Western Hemisphere in his or her vein. He said, if you don't have that blood, he said, if you got that blood, then you're an Indian. If you don't have that blood, you belong to a special tribe called the Wanabe tribe. I said, what is that? He said,
I love that story. So quickly, I'm going to show some photos of people who are Native American. And if you look at them, you would say that they look African American, but they are actually Native American people, Crow tribesmen, Algonquin people. These are photos that were taken of people that have been misclassified or identified as something else. Now, mind you, when those natives were pushed to Oklahoma, a lot of our people intermingled with the African Americans or the Black people of America today because they were being hunted. If they did not go to Oklahoma, they were being hunted for their scalps. And that's a whole nother story that we can get into. But so it was easier for them to say that they were Black than to say that they were Native for fear of being killed.
That's right. They had a price on Indian scalps back then. And a lot of people that were Native would not admit to being Native because the U.S. government would pay their government agents $100 for a man's scalp, $50 for a woman, and $25 for children from infancy to adolescency. So that's why they said, no, I'm not Indian, I'm Black.
And it's very interesting because, like I said, there was never an issue of color here. These two girls right here are, I believe they may be sisters.
Yes.
They both have the same, they're sisters. They're sisters, and you would see one of them looks darker than the other, but these two girls are sisters of the same tribe. But nobody made a difference between who was of color and who was of not.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many of us that have this heritage that have now been classified as Black. The Jackson Five were Cherokee. Of course, we know Billy Hendricks. Billy Hendricks.
Jimmy.
Jimi Hendrix. Sorry. Jimi Hendrix.
Wrong generation, kid.
Yeah, I'm thinking Billy Preston. I'm thinking on him.
Tina
Turner. It's Choctaw. There's a lot of people that, you know, the Neville brothers are Choctaw. A lot of people who have been identified as Black are actually of Native heritage.
And James Brown was Apache.
Yep, James Brown was actually Apache, believe it or not.
Yep.
So a lot of us share in this heritage.
Oh yeah.
So what you see, as someone who is represented as African American or Black here in the United States, you need to look a little deeper, because in there is Native heritage.
Yes. Can I say thank you, Leslie, for doing this tonight, because this is so important and we need to do follow-ups on it.
Definitely. I will, Tracy. I will put in posts for everyone some of the books that you can refer to educate yourselves a little bit more, and we could continue discussion maybe later on because there's so much more context that we can go into. So before we close, I would like to get any comments from Ron, Elder Ron, and Barry and Mary, and Tracy if she's able to speak.
Well, it's been it's been an enlightening series. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to really delve into an entirety of the subject matter. But does that sound like gobbledygook? It isn't. I really enjoyed Jay. I enjoyed your presentation, and Leslie, you fascinate me. Your awareness and your continuing growth on the subject matter is just overwhelming. And it's been a really interesting series.
I could not do this without having people to embrace me to find out a little bit more. So I have to thank you, Elder Nightwolf, Barry, Tracy. I couldn't do this, and I couldn't be on this path of growth and knowledge without you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So in post this evening, I will put some of this there for any of our audience members who want to look at some footage. I highly recommend, there is a movie that I'll put a link to called Black Indians, An American Story. That is just amazing. It is narrated by James Earl Jones, who is also of Indigenous heritage, and I highly recommend it. Cherokee. That you can watch it on YouTube, and it'll give you a little bit more context about that intersection. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Our next ROTI series will be on the Pow-Wow, which is coming in May. So we're very excited about that. And